My name is Skyler Webster, and I am coming to you from the United States in Denver, Colorado. I lead our product development division at Western Union, specifically related to the education vertical. And today I'm going to talk to you about what the future holds for international student recruitment. Okay, so let's touch on Western Union and what we do for the education sector. So at Western Union, we help top universities around the world manage their international finance processes, and this helps the universities expand globally. And so we work with 8 of the top 10 ranked institutions for the Times Higher Education World Academic Rankings. And also we've moved over $14 billion for universities around the world. And this is both incoming funds, so funds where maybe international students are paying into the university, as well as outgoing payments, so where universities need to pay vendors or pay traveling overseas professors. So we definitely have a unique view on the education sector because we see it in a truly global perspective. So today I want to talk to you about how we see some of the challenges and opportunities that have faced the higher education sector right now. We'll kind of bring insights not from one university, not from one country, but kind of from that global perspective and how things are differing from each region. So let's first start off with what we saw before COVID and some of the trends we were seeing. Before COVID, we were definitely seeing the growth of international student mobility overall. There were some underlying landscape shifts where we were seeing the growth of Asia as certain international students were choosing to still travel internationally, but just stay closer to home. We also were seeing strong growth rates in Australia and Canada, and all of these factors combined were creating some challenges for those traditional dominant markets like the UK and US and in attracting international students. But now with COVID and how COVID plays out, really all corridors are being impacted. International students are down in terms of the populations at schools, and that's a given. But the reality is we're seeing the effect more strongly in some regions than others, and we're also seeing some interesting patterns that we weren't seeing in our business before, which is kind of the demand for institutions to be able to send refunds and other payments to students really quickly. So let's look at some of those today. First, let's look from a host country perspective. And when I say host country, I mean, where are the students traveling to for school? And while the pandemic has had, a definite effect, leaving nobody unscathed, we are definitely seeing differences in relation to the severity of the impact. So Australia is seeing the biggest impact, and this could be due to the proximity to China, the fact that they do get a very large percent of students from China. It could be the time in which the pandemic hit them. It was right during their peak enrollment season, right? School starts in March in Australia. The pandemic was really starting to take effect in February, March, and that could be the reason it's hit so hard. US and Canada, UK, holding up a little bit better. But I'll also say that we should bear in mind that's still playing out. It's peak enrollment season now. Many of these schools are just seeing students start to travel, start to make their payments. So the true impact on these regions might still be yet to see. But let's take a look at another perspective. If we look at some of the send countries, and what I mean by send countries, I mean, where are international students traveling from? What are their home countries? And we can see from this picture, a varied picture emerging, right? So this graph shows a baseline. That's kind of the line in the middle. And that reflects the global market trend from our data of international students. What we can see here is some regions are holding up better. They're outperforming the global average or over-indexing, right? That, if you take a look, you can see countries, many countries in Europe or North America. And then below the line, you can see heavily impacted countries in Asia and South America. And what I think is interesting is I try to draw conclusions from this and say, well, look at some of the developing economies, right? Especially in those heavily hit by COVID. So if you look above the line, you'll see US, UK, Spain, Italy, right? And those were heavily hit by COVID, but seem to still be overperforming the global average. Whereas in Asia, if we look at the developed economies, um, so let's see, yeah, Hong Kong, Singapore, Japan, even Malaysia, they're underperforming against the global average. So it's just interesting. I think this is still playing out. I mean, I guess you could say they're faring better than a Nepal or a Pakistan on this slide, but there's definitely some global differences here where some of the send markets, right, are being more impacted than others. And I think as we watch this through the months of August and September and the peak seasons, if you will, enrollment seasons, for your North American universities, we're going to see how this picture continues to change, but definitely interesting. The other key insight, as I mentioned earlier, that we're seeing from our transaction data and even from talking to our schools is we're seeing volumes grow and inquiries from institutions in terms of how they can set up flexible payment systems, how they can get funds quickly out to students. And I think we'll discuss some of the drivers of that later in the presentation, but definitely a thing that's different for our business through the COVID time. So if we look from a qualitative perspective, because also the last 3 or 4 months, we've talked to a lot of universities, and probably a lot of this mimics what's happening at your universities, right? But we've really been told that there was a lack in BCP planning, business continuity planning, and preparation and prep. And that was kind of built as a response to the pandemic, that partners were having to rely heavily on their vendors to make sure that they had proper BCP in place and that business as usual could be maintained. From a positive side, I think what came from the pandemic and what continues to come from the pandemic is the innovation. So, processes that our clients are now telling us they feel more enabled to adapt more nimbly in the future. And I think it's something we're even excited about and some things I want to touch on today. Because what we think about innovation, Western Union has done a couple research studies, and I want to draw some insights from those research studies today. This first one that you're seeing on the screen, we explored the drivers of international students and what drove their decision to study at one university versus another, or why an international student would favor to study in the US versus Australia. And obviously there's obvious academic reasons, but there's 5 key trends here where an international student kind of over-indexed a domestic student. And these trends were sustainability, activism, technology, hybridity, and well-being. And if we look at these and how these have evolved through the pandemic, it's really interesting. So the first one, or if we think, because these 3 really, if you look at hybridity, technology, and even well-being through the COVID pandemic, I think these 3 trends in particular have really accelerated and evolved much faster than when we ever would have thought. So that's kind of exciting, I think. And let's think about that in more detail here. So especially if we start with digital transformation, this one has probably marked the most acceleration for obvious reasons. And I think that's a good thing, but there are some learnings that we've gotten, right? So this is obvious, the study shows that, the generation of students enrolling in schools right now obviously are digital natives, just like the domestic students, and they expect digital interactions through their life, through their socialization, through their apps, and even through their digital payments. They're used to paying from their phone, WeChat, Alipay, whatever the case may be. And as a result, they're expecting that same level of digital sophistication when they select their university. But what the pandemic has told us, right, and that's all in the research study, but what the pandemic has taught us is that technology is not the full solution. That students still want to engage in face-to-face learning, they still want to interact with their peers, And so I think as we think about the post-COVID environment, we want to create, technology as an enabler for that smart campus, but not necessarily rely on it 100%. We want to provide, that those in-person interactions so that students can get the most from their international experience. On the next slide, this kind of shows some of the research that we've done around global services. And obviously, we think of international education as a key part of the global services sector, right? And really, what we can see from some of the things here is that international education and providing the education to these international students is not unique from any other service worldwide, and the shift that's happening to digitally deliver services. So a few of the things I'll call out here: 62% of the total growth um, will come from in the services sector is going to come from digitally delivered services. So organizations are having to get creative, and if they don't adopt digital delivery, they're gonna fall behind. And look, you guys know this, you've been living this for the past few months, right? As you're trying to force your organization to upskill and invest in infrastructure to deliver digital services, or create that backup plan to do that if you need to. So I think it's just important to recognize that institutions aren't alone in this, that this is really the service sector overall, that this is happening to. And if we look at some countries' readiness, right, there are digital hotspots that kind of start to evolve and come out in our research for the services industry. And this is hotspots if you look at it from a technology readiness and from a innovation perspective. And some key countries that get called out here, you have Korea and Japan, Australia and New Zealand, and even some Middle East countries. So, I think as we see where folks are heavily investing in digital technologies, these trends will be something to watch, because these destinations for international student recruitment really could start offering more, smarter international student experiences than they were before. Similarly, on the next slide, this represents those same kind of digital hotspot countries, but it shows it in comparison to other locations around the world. And on the left is where they kind of score on technology readiness, and on the right is that innovation score related to GDP, which is on your vertical axis. And so really, some of these countries that are high on these two levels, you assume are going to kind of really jump up to that right-hand corner and that right-hand quadrant, and are really prepared to do so. So I think it'll be interesting to watch that, maybe from an education perspective, maybe from just an overall services perspective, but it will be interesting to watch. So really, as the digital trend plays out throughout the pandemic, post-pandemic, we know the impact on international student recruitment is going to mean that physical location is less important, because there's going to be more options. So I want to touch on some of the other key trends that international students are interested in, because there will need to be a balance if we're going to attract these international students and influence their decision making. So let's look at well-being, for example. So health, security, well-being, this is really speaking to both physical and mental. And, our study said that 72% of international students said that how a university looks after their mental health and well-being would influence their decision to study at that university. Look, this is a great example of a trend that over the last 4 months has moved significantly faster and evolved much faster than we ever thought, right? COVID is forcing universities to focus on well-being. We're seeing advancements much quicker here than we would have without the pandemic. So if we think about it, right, a good example is that if you look at some of the countries with high death rates from COVID, they may be looked at differently from international students who are thinking of going to that foreign country. And they may look at health security as a key factor in that choice. And so, institutions in these regions really should ensure that their recruitment efforts are speaking to the health and well-being credentials of the students. And look, this is happening, right? Mental resilience is a key factor. Students have definitely had to navigate issues like loss of part-time jobs. Many students were sent home and or are feeling isolated in this foreign country, or they've suddenly had to move out of their accommodation. And we're seeing universities really, like I say, evolve in this because they've had to put new policies in place to protect and nurture these students and communicate to them effectively as part of the value proposition. And one of the things we've seen in our business is we've seen an overwhelmingly number of universities come to us and say, we need help. We need a solution to get financial aid payments out to our students to help mitigate the impact of the pandemic. So this is definitely an area where we're seeing advancements. Hybridity. This is kind of the third trend that's changing quickly or more quickly due to COVID than it would have otherwise. And what do I mean by hybridity? Hybridity is basically that flexibility and blurred lines between work and personal life. It's what a lot of us experience. We don't work 8 to 5, right? You have your phone with you at all times. You take a late night call. You might pick up your kids in the middle of the day. It's that idea that there's this blurred line and this ultimate flexibility. And before COVID, we talked to universities about, how international students want that flexible yet collaborative learning environment. They want that mix of digital and in-person learning environments. And this is advanced, right? So through COVID time, we're hearing, definitely universities look at more digital programs. We're looking at schools deferring start dates, looking at even the traditional start dates in Australia. I'm hearing from certain universities, maybe we shouldn't be doing September and March as our semesters. Maybe we should look at modifying. And so I think from all of this, the hybridity and that idea of flexibility is moving faster already. And this should help our students, right? Because they're not going to be in education forever and in the university space. They're going to enter that work environment where the flexibility is going to be expected. So I think hybridity is definitely one of those that's moving faster. The two final trends that international students really look for is sustainability and activism. And these haven't really fallen off the radar during COVID, but they haven't necessarily evolved faster, over the last few months than they otherwise would have. But it's at least worth touching on them. So, when we think about sustainability, this is the idea that really climate change hasn't gone away; it's not going away, and that this will drive students' decision making. I mean, as we saw earlier, right, digital transformation is causing the world to be smaller. And so in order to encourage students to travel to your institution, you have to have a clear message around sustainability credentials. And, many of our universities as clients have told us how, they have plans to go to zero emissions. But if you have this goal, we recommend that you definitely talk about it with your international students because they do care about it. And Activision was the fifth category. And this one's interesting, right? I mean, 72% of students feel more engaged with the university who takes a stand on social issues. The research indicates that international students really want that value-driven institution that really reflects their beliefs. And this is in action now, and it's not due to COVID, right? I mean, I think this has really evolved and is in the front of all of us as the world has joined Black Lives Matters protests, and even before that was supporting Greta Thunberg in terms of the environmental activists going on. And so I think this is becoming more and more evident globally. And just something that institutions can keep in mind as they are trying to win the hearts and minds of students and ensure these international students that they align with their beliefs and values. So if we look ahead here, um, I want to share some forecasts because as we come out of COVID, I think the landscape of student mobility is going to change. And the pandemic has definitely highlighted at many institutions our over reliance on international students from China and India. And if you look at the data on the right-hand side of this slide, you can see that China and India are going to continue to dominate, right? Their population of 18 to 22-year-olds, they're number 1 and 2 in the country and are going to continue to be that way. But I do encourage institutions to look at other regions where populations are growing, um, where there's great, bright young minds that have the potential students for you, and really, you can focus on to diversify. Um, so I guess some closing thoughts from me. Um, One is, let's see, this has been a challenging time for our sector. There's no doubt about it. We've all felt the impact. And I basically absolutely am proud of the way the education sector has adopted. I hope you guys are as well. I encourage you to maintain flexibility in your outlook, so that we can all emerge successfully. I applaud the innovation that's going on, especially around some of the key trends where international students really over index, and so I think that's been exciting. If you have questions, we are still, Western Union will be at our virtual booth. You can get copies of any of the research studies. A lot of this data goes into much more detail on the future of international education, as well as the global services trade revolution. So if you want a copy of those studies or just want to talk more, come stop by the virtual stand. I think the other thing I will leave you with is that we all know that these have been challenging times. Um, the Western Union Foundation really does care about education. It's one of our focuses, and so they recently announced that we're going to be providing $250,000 in financial aid during this tough time for international students. So if you're a university in US, Canada, France, UK, or Australia, you can come and nominate 5 of your international students to be considered for these payments. So stop by, talk about the research, nominate students, or find out how your institution can nominate students. And I'll leave with that. So a few questions have come in here. I'll answer them as they come in, so keep sending them in here. The first question comes from Paul James. It says, with budgets reduced, how do you envision recruitment marketing strategies will be impacted in the next 12 months? Universities spend a large amount on student recruitment to attract internationals, but this is already being cut dramatically. So, Paul, I think you're exactly right. We're going to see the evolution that has happened due to COVID, where a lot of the recruitment has been brought online. So we've even seen, as we've talked to some of our universities, the rise. How are you doing your recruitment this year due to COVID? And there was a rise in digital events, digital marketing, one-on-one qualifying meetings versus in-person meetings versus travel. So we were already seeing, I think, due to COVID, kind of a shift of things going online. And I think given budget cuts, that's going to continue to be the way in the next 12 months as that's going to go. Less costly channels to attract international students. And I don't think we're going to see, as much as in my presentation, I want to encourage universities to diversify from China and India and some of those larger populations that they've become very reliant on. It might be hard to enter new markets for international recruitment if you don't have the already established relationships with education agents in those markets. Sometimes entering a new market can be more expensive and harder. So I do think we will see folks and different schools rely on the channels that work for them and pushing more towards those digital channels. Great, several more coming in here. Thank you guys. I have one here that says, do you have any suggestions about the internationalization at home strategy? And I don't. I think my one suggestion here is that students especially are much more in the digital era, and they're going to be much more used to things happening digital. And that's the way everything's moving right now. Payments are going digital, everything's going digital. So we have to find a way to internationalize from a digital perspective. Hopefully with some of the trends happening, the bandwidth investment we see happening in different countries, that will be easier. But I think we're going to have to get creative and get flexible, allow for at-home strategies initially here, but in the future, later studies, hopefully, when the pandemic is cleared, allow folks to get back in person, because I don't think everything can be done from a digital perspective. The next one comes from Albert here. He says, with the East and West decoupling, what changes to the flow of international students do you expect? Will there be fewer students going from East to West? Thank you. Yeah, it'll be interesting to watch the international student trends. I mean, already pre-COVID, we were seeing students wanting to stay closer to home. We already saw, even 5 years ago, China was not a destination for international students, and now it's number 3 in the world for international students. So, and it doesn't necessarily mean that, students aren't traveling. It's that we may see them staying closer to home from those Asian countries where they would just choose to stay closer to home. So I definitely, like I said, think we need to diversify, and it's going to be harder. We're going to have to work harder to recruit international students to the traditional destinations, the UK, the US, Australia. We're just going to have to sell a little bit harder. The good news is the data says that these markets, these traditional dominant markets, are still going to be the markets of the future. These are still the markets they want to come to. Reputation is a key influencing factor for many universities. But hitting on some of those things I think I covered in the presentation, making sure that your university stands out in terms of well-being, and in terms of your digital strategy, and in terms of your sustainability and activism. All of those categories are important to international students, even more so than domestic students. So I think definitely catering your marketing to some of those will be important, because we are going to have to work harder, especially now. Continuing down the chain here, how will recruitment change for the traditional research-intensive institutions who rely heavily on their reputation compared to younger universities who may be more adept at innovating and working harder at their student recruitment? And sorry, my screen's jumping around here a little bit. Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great comment, right? Related to different universities are going to have to work differently and are going to be impacted differently. I would think that when you rely heavily on your reputation, that's going to continue to help you, especially when the East to West movement, kind of like Albert was talking about, because the reputation is going to continue to be there, and it will continue to attract international students. I think some of those younger universities are going to have to work harder for their recruitment. And they're going to have to do so in a different way. Like we said, they may have to look at new markets, but also different tactics. We can't always rely on travel, especially when budgets are being reduced and getting face-to-face in front of these students. So I definitely think relying on those online categories. I also think communication will be key with prospective students and international students in general. One thing that was surprising to me in talking to some of my universities this fall is how often they were talking to their students. It was obviously an uncertain time, but we saw that universities were talking to their students like several times a week. And that was on average about 40% of our universities were talking to them that frequently. And that really surprised me. But I think that high touch situation, even over email will help students, and maybe that lends itself even to the prospective students as well. Thank you guys, lots of questions coming in here. This is really good. So I'm reading this as I go here. Do you see the trend for unconditional places continuing? And what is the impact of this on both universities and students? And during university and post-universities as students enter the job market for the UK systems. The trend for unconditional places. I think what we're talking about here, Maggie, and I'm trying to understand your questions, it's always hard when it's a one-way communication, is you're talking about, I think, the destination for where international students are coming from. And I think if we looked at the growth charts from some of those charts, we definitely saw India and China continuing to dominate in terms of the population growth of 18 to 22-year-olds. But we also saw some new markets. We're seeing Nepal, we're seeing Bangladesh, you know, we're seeing Nigeria, especially in the UK. It sounds like you're in the UK system. And so I definitely think we will continue to see those. I think as we saw there, though, some of those markets have been hit harder by COVID. Some of those underdeveloped markets definitely have taken a larger hit than some of the developed markets. And so I do think we will continue to see them, and we need to cater towards them in the post-COVID world, and in the post-university system. So as they come over, I think supporting these students, many of them want to stay. So I know there's been different rules and regulations throughout the years that have changed, and most recently in the UK, and how long someone can stay in country post-university. So it'll be interesting to watch those. I definitely think those countries will be ones to watch. And I think universities should pay attention to them. Heavy reliance in one jurisdiction can be really scary as we're trying to run a business. And if you rely on those international students, you know, diversifying is a good thing. Okay. Here's a question. How will the hybrid policy of teaching affect the flow of international students amongst East to West universities? Yeah, that's really interesting. I don't know. If I was a fortune teller, I would know more. I think, like I said, all of this is going to be interesting to play out as we look at our data of where international students are coming from, as we look at even, you know, the UK and the US and Canada who are going through their peak enrollment season right now, and how that's impacted will be interesting. I think students will, and this is, like I said, I think students will have I guess I would say they'll have a certain tolerance for hybrid learning as an international student. They may be okay with a semester, but ultimately many of these students are looking for that in-person learning, and maybe not 100%. They may enjoy the hybridity of it all, but they do want that balance of the in-person learning. So I think some students, we are already seeing them defer and choosing to not do an online situation for 2020 and just defer to 2021. So we are seeing some of that. So I think we'll just see how long it all lasts. I'm not a fortune teller, as I started off with, but as we see what happens with COVID, will the second phase come around here? How deep of a recession do some markets go into? And how long will this last? What does hybrid actually look like? I think some of those questions will come out as we see how long this lasts, because I think there's only a certain tolerance for the international students will have in doing things entirely online. It's that double-edged sword. Same with digital, right? They want to do digital, but they also want the in-person learning. They want their cake and they want to eat it too. So I think initially they may be okay with it, but if it lasts a longer time, we may see drop-offs altogether of international students. We really might see them stay closer to home versus go so far. Okay, another question from Maggie. Maggie Jones, how will student attitudes to education, or how have students' attitudes to education shifted the last few years? Are they more interested in reputation as they enter the job market, or better facilities and contact hours? Maggie, that's a really good question. And some of the information that we've seen is certain international jurisdictions really care about reputation. Specifically, we see a lot of the Chinese and India students' reputation will continue to be top notch. I think some of these emerging markets, reputation isn't as important, and they are more interested in what you can supply them in terms of how long they can stay in country, what kind of job placement can you give them, what are the facilities that you can offer them. And so I do think some of these, like I said, these emerging markets would be really good for some of these younger institutions to focus on, pushing some of the things we know are important to international students, talking about your plan for sustainability, talking about your plan for their well-being. Some of these are, it's hard for them to choose a university, hence some of their heavy reliance on these educational institutions. And if you can focus on these areas that we know are important to them, where they over-index those domestic students, I do think that will really help kind of your value proposition in attracting those international students. Great. Good questions. More are coming in here. So Martin Thomas has a question, and it is, will diversifying campuses be a strategy for universities this year? You mentioned diversifying recruitment. So will we see a change, particularly in Australia? I look, the universities I talk to want to diversify, especially in Australia. There's a heavy reliance on the Chinese student base. International students represent 50% of the international students, and they're going to continue to want to be attractive there. But I have talked to many of our universities in Australia and other regions where they are looking to diversify. You know, especially, obviously, I'm from the United States, and if you look at some of the political policies that have changed, even in Australia, there were huge political movements happening this year with the Chinese market. And so I think that scares the universities, and they are heavily reliant on international students. So I think we will see a change in recruitment strategies. It's hard for us to make that change in Australia because many of them are heavily reliant on the education agents. And so those education agents, having to build those new relationships is hard in new jurisdictions. And that's what we've often heard, is that they want to diversify, but it's expensive and it's hard to enter new markets. The visa policy is really hard for those Australian institutions, and so making sure you have those education agents who can help them through that visa process is really important. So there's definitely some challenges there. But I am already seeing, I mean, Bangladesh, Nepal, even Sri Lanka, we're seeing definitely some more ramp up in our volumes in terms of international students from countries that before we hadn't seen, right? Africa was one we were seeing a few years ago, and that continues to grow, but now we are seeing some of those Asian countries that are new. Oh, okay. Miguel Barbosa has a question. Just looking at how I'm doing on time. COVID-19 has created a new market in delivering knowledge. Universities are no longer the unique players in this game. With the incorporation of online teaching, the big technological sharks, Google, YouTube, might see this as an opportunity of capital gain. How do you think universities can outcompete the big companies like Google in a digital world? Great question. And I do think these players and other players outside of the university world may be playing a role in kind of upskilling our workforce as far as the digital revolution that we're experiencing. And I remember sitting in Zurich, you know, a year ago at the Times higher education event, listening to the conversations around the digital revolution and how universities can play a role in upskilling. And I do think some of these players, such as your Googles, your YouTube, your bigger corporations, may be playing a role there more, especially if things have started to move really fast due to COVID, right? We're seeing definitely an evolution that's much faster paced than we had ever expected, but it's fast tracked our attitudes. And so I think we'll continue to see universities and students want to go to universities for the job placements. So I think that's a huge focus that they can say is these larger companies are going to have kind of that singular view, and it may help with the upskill for that one university, but universities are going to span across multiple areas and help with the job placement and ultimately with the experience. We saw the data. These students do want a digital experience. They do want the experience of the hybrid learning that's going to get them ready for the workforce in the future, because nowadays there is no 9-to-5 job or turning off and turning on. Everything's kind of this blurred together in this hybrid life that we're all living. And so these students are going to be looking, I think, for certain in-person learning that they can't get from these companies. They may be able to, like I said, upskill and supplement, but they aren't going to get that full experience that many of them are looking for. So focusing on some of those, I think, will be important for the universities to continue to play a role in these segments. Thank you for the interaction today. Although virtual, it was still a good discussion.